him follow-up questions, and Jan Bharat then begins to instruct. So the first instruction he gives is kind of a chastisement. Although you are not experienced, you're speaking like an experienced person, right? Because King Rahugana was talking about how the soul should be affected by the pains of the body, how as a king it's a duty to chastise others, and does not necessarily mean that he's in the bodily conception. So Jan Bharat begins by chastising. The first 3 verses he says how one who is materially invested cannot understand spiritual topics, right? So he then begins to talk about the root cause of the illusion of the jiva being illusion, right? Which no surprise is is essentially the mind. So we will resume our discussion from verse 6. So verse 5 and 6 are kind of companion verses which give the 9 characteristics of the mind. And and so we'll do the verse 6 and then we'll summarize all the 9 characteristics. So verse 6. Dukham sukham vyatiriktam cha tivram kalo papanam phalam avyanakti alingyamaya rachitana taratma swadehinam samsriti chakrakuta. Sanskrit, can you read the translation, please?
Yep. The materialistic mind, covering the living entity as soul, carries it to different species of life. This is called continued material existence. Due to the mind, the living entity suffers or enjoys material distress and happiness. Being thus illusion, the mind further creates pious and impious activities and their karma, and thus the soul becomes conditioned.
So these concepts are presented and discussed in the Bhagavad Gita of how a person's absorption in the material conception is the cause of repeated material births. This is just a revision for the fact. So Vishnu Chakravarti, he comments on this verse and he says that the mind is like a village cheater. It creates a covering around the living entity. It creates distress, happiness, and illusion in due course of time. And Srila Prabhupada, he summarizes this verse, drawing mostly from the Bhagavad Gita. He says that how the mental activities under the influence of material nature cause happiness and distress. Being covered by illusion, the living entity eternally continues conditioned life under different designation. Such living entities are known as Nityabadhas, eternally conditioned. On the whole, the mind is the cause of the conditioned life. So this term Nityabadha, it attracts its own level of discussion or controversy. Right? There are people who say that when the jiva in the material world is called Nityabadha, it means that the jiva is eternally in the material world. And if the jiva is eternally in the material world, then there is no fall of the jiva. And then there is another school of thought which basically is endorsed by Srila Prabhupada, which talks about the fact that Nityabadda points to the fact that the conditioning of the jiva happened so far back in time that there is no known point of origin, and thus it is considered to be eternal. Now, both the schools, they converge on the fact that whether the jiva fell or whether the jiva was born fallen, they both agree on the fact that the jiva returns back to Godhead when it executes bhakti. Otherwise, the whole purpose of the scriptures, the process of bhakti would be irrelevant. So, so many times when this discussion happens, this point is made. Srila Prabhupada also makes this point. I think it goes Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, they don't worry into the cause of the fall or whether the jiva fell or not. What is important is returning back home. I think Bhakti Siddhanta gives this example of a person trapped in a house in fire. Important thing is to get out of the house than to go about investigating where did the fire start, when did it start, how did it start. Best is to focus on getting out. Srila Prabhupada continues saying that if the mind is controlled, the senses are automatically controlled, and therefore the soul is saved from the reaction of pious and impious activities. And then he gives the solution also. That's Savai Mana Krishna Padaravinda. That by engaging the mind in the lotus feet of the Lord, that as soon as one is engaged in that, yogi namapi sarvesham madgatinantar atmana, the person becomes the perfect yogi. Prabhupada said this antaratma, the mind is conditioned by material nature. As stated here, Maya rachita antara swadehinam samsmriti chakrakuta. The mind being most powerful covers the living entity and puts him in the waves of material existence. Verse 7. Tavanayam yavavara shodavihi kshetragya saksho bhavati sthula sukshma tasman manolingam mado vadanti guna gunatvasya paravarasya.
The mind makes a living entity within this material world wander through different spaces of life, and thus the living entity experiences mundane affairs in different forms as a human being, demigod, fat person, skinny person, and so forth. Learned scholars say that bodily appearance, bondage, and liberation are caused by the mind.
So the point that is made over here is that the samsara is caused by the mind. The mind makes the living entity within this material world wander through the different species of life, right? And because of the mind, the soul considers itself to be either a human or a demigod or a fat or a skinny person. Now, the last line of the verse is the redeeming line, as far as the mind is concerned. Now, the learned scholars say that the bodily appearance, bondage, and liberations are caused by the mind. So, while the mind is the cause of the bondage, the mind is also the cause of the liberation. And Srila Prabhupada comments on it. He started commenting on it in the previous verse, that Savai Mana Krishna Padaravindo, that when the mind is surrendered to Krishna, it becomes the cause of liberation. So that's why the mind is known as Para-Vara. So Avara means material and Para means spiritual. So it can be both depending on where it is used. And Prabhupada gives the example that it's not just the mind, but everything that is there in this material creation is Paravara. And at one point, everything is Para. The thing becomes material when it is seen as separate from Krishna. When that distinction ceases, then it resumes its position as being spiritual. So this applies to everything, not just the mind, but to the senses, to even jad, to even inanimate matter. And the Prabhupada quotes the example of prasadam, that when we enjoy it for our own senses, it's the cause of bondage. And when we offer it to Krishna, then it becomes a cause of the liberation. Like Sarvapadi Vinirmukta Tat Pratvena Nirmalam Rishikena Rishikesha Sevanam Bhakti Ruchyate. That when we let go of all the material titles, upadhis, and simply consider ourselves in relationship to Krishna, then Tat Pratvena Nirmalam Rishikena Rishikesha. That when we use the senses in the service of the proprietor of the senses, which is Krishna, then everything becomes perfect. As long as that conception is not there, the other conception of me being a human or a demigod or a cat or a dog or a Hindu or a Muslim is going to be dominant. Okay, moving on to verse 8. Gunanukritam vyasanaya jantoho shemaya nai gunayannato manahasya yatha pradipo grahatavartim ashnan sikha sadhuma bhajati hayanadasum padam tatha gunakarmanubadham vritir manaha shrayate nayatra tattvam.
When the living entity's mind becomes absorbed in the sense gratification of the material world, it brings about his conditioned life and suffering within the material situation. However, when the mind becomes unattached to material enjoyment, it becomes the cause of liberation. When the flame in a lamp burns the wick improperly, the lamp is blackened. But when the lamp is filled with ghee and is burning properly, there is bright illumination. Similarly, the mind is absorbed in material sense gratification. It causes suffering, and when detached from material sense gratification, it brings about the original brightness of Krishna consciousness.
So previous verse that Bharat had said that how the mind can be the cause of liberation as well as conditioning. Here he explains the same concept with an example. So when the mind is attached to the modes, it's a cause of the suffering. When it is detached, it's the cause of the liberation. So the analogy of the lamp is given that when there is plenty of ghee, then the wick of the lamp will burn brightly. However, when there is not sufficient ghee, then the wick will burn itself. It will become charred. There will be no bright light. So similarly, if the mind is covered with the three modes, so the mind covered with three modes is like a wick that does not have access to the ghee. Then the mind burns itself. So on the other hand, when the mind is not covered by the modes, which means now the wick has full access to the ghee, then the mind will shine with its qualities. Right? So 6 qualities of the mind have been described so far. That it is the chief of the 16 elements, it is endowed with favorable and unfavorable impressions, that it is attached to the sense objects, it is agitated by the gunas, it is transformed by the emotions, and it supports different forms. So this is the qualities of the materialistic mind that have been given. And the relationship between the mind and the gunas is given by this analogy, that when the mind is submerged in the gunas, then the mind essentially heats within itself, does not produce any light. It just burns itself. And as opposed to the opposite, when the gunas are removed, then the mind has full access to its spiritual potency, and then it shines. Prabhupada says that it shines in the original brightness of Krishna consciousness. So Prabhupada says that we can therefore conclude that the mind is the cause of material existence and liberation. Now, when we are discussing the role of the mind, and it's an important discussion, it would almost look like the mind is forcing the jiva into a material existence, and the jiva has to fight against the mind. The mind in itself is inanimate, because the only thing that is animate is the jiva. So then how can we say that it is the mind that is godly in existence, it's the mind that is the cause of the liberation, it's the mind that is the cause of the material suffering? So this is very similar to the relationship of the jiva with the material world, that the material world only has that much of control over the jiva as the jiva allows it. So if the statement were to be read in its entirety, it would read as the jiva, when allows the mind to control it, then the mind is the cause of the material existence. If the jiva gives control to the mind is godly in its power. Right? It's like a person is trying to break a rock, and then the person may take a nail or a chisel or a hammer or a sledgehammer. They're all inanimate objects, but they have different potencies. With a nail, the person might be able to do a little bit of difference, but with a sledgehammer, the person can make a huge difference. Now, does that mean the sledgehammer is more powerful than the nail? Yes and no. It is more powerful, but in itself, they're both the same. They're both lying without any ability. The sledgehammer is able to amplify the power of the user. The nail does the opposite of it. So that's the role of the mind. That it's not that the mind is controlling the jiva, but when the jiva allows the mind to control it, then it is godly and power. So Prabhupada says it is therefore proper to train the mind or cleanse the mind from material attachment, right? Which means that at one point we are saying that the mind has godly power over the jiva. And then Srila Prabhupada is saying that it is therefore necessary to train the mind, which essentially means that it's just a tool. The jiva needs to be able to use the tool properly. And how to train the mind? And this is one of Prabhupada's favorite verses in this context, Mamchovi Bicharena, Bhakti Yogena Sevate, So Gunan Samatyetan Brahma Bhuyayate Kalpyate. That when engages in full devotional service, he at once transcends the three modes. So for devotee, that is the way of training the mind, that when you engage your mind in bhakti, it becomes the cause of liberation. Okay, moving on to the next verse, verse 9. Ekadasan manaso hi vritya akutyaha pancha dhiyo bhimanaha matrani karmani puram chatasham vadanti haikadasa virabhumehi.
There are 5 working senses and 5 knowledge acquiring senses. There is also the false ego. In this way, there are 11 items for the mind's influence function. O hero, the object of the senses, such as sound and touch, the organic activities, such as evacuation, and the different type of bodies, society, friendship, and personality are considered by learned scholars a field of activity for the function of the mind.
So the 11 functions of the uh, uh, of the mind are given over here. So there are 5 knowledge acquiring senses, and there is 5 action senses and false ego, and then corresponding to the 11 senses are the 11 object of the senses. So this we have done in a fair amount of details when we were reading the development of the universal form, that what are the 5 senses, the knowledge acquiring senses. So for the 5 knowledge acquiring senses, like this sense of eyes and sight, sense of sight and smell and touch and taste, there are 5 objects which are the tanmatras. And then for the 5 working senses are the 5 objects of the senses. So these are the objects on which the actions are performed. This will be explained in the next verse. The Prabhupada says that the mind is a controller of the 5 knowledge acquiring senses and the 5 working senses. Each sense has a particular field of activity, but in all cases, the mind is the controller. By the false ego, one thinks oneself, the body, and thinks in terms of my body, my house, my family, my society, my nation, and so on. These false identifications are due to the expansions of the false ego. And so this is a more technical aspect of how the false identification expands through the avenue of the mind. Prabhupada gives a sneak preview. It's going to be explained more in the next verse. So we will study the next verse and then expand upon it. Okay, verse 10. Gandhakriti sparsha rasa sarvamshi vishva naratya artya bilat shilpa ekadasam shivarnam meti sayam aham dvadasam ekahuha.
Sound, touch, form, taste, and smell are the objects of the 5 knowledge acquiring senses. Speech, touch, movement, evacuation, and sexual intercourse are the object of the working senses. Beside this, there is another conception by which one thinks, this is my body, this is my society, this is my family, this is my nation, and so forth. This 11 function that the mind is called the false ego. According to some philosopher, this is the 12th function and field of activity is the body.
Again, this is something we are familiar with. We have the 5 knowledge senses: sound, touch, form, smell, and taste. We have the 5 working senses: speech and movement, evacuation, and sexual activities. We have, and then, so that makes for the 10. And then we have the false ego. And the false ego is essentially twofold, which is the aham mameti, right? Which is the I and the mind. I am the body, and through the body, one gets the sense of mind, that this is my family, my society, etc. So the point that is being developed here is how through the mind, this material conception becomes wider and wider. That the single mind establishes itself now in these 10 senses. the 5 knowledge senses and the 5 working senses. Each one of them have an object, and then there is multiple interactions that happen. This is further expanded in the next verse. So Prabhupada says that there are different objects for the 11 items. So through the nose we can smell, through the eyes we can hear, through the eyes we can see, through the ears we can hear, and in this way we gather knowledge. Similarly, there is the karmendriyas, the hands, leg, genitals, rectum, mouth, and so forth. And then the 11th is the false ego. What is the object of false ego? So just like for the knowledge senses, there is the field of activity. For the working sense, there is the field of activity. The object of false ego is aham mamekti. And the object of the false ego is that I am the body and all this belongs to me. Okay. Verse 11. Dravya svabhavasya karma kale ekadashami manaso vikaraha sahasra sahasatasha potishasya cha kshetrya tuna mithona swatahasyo.
The physical elements, nature, the original cause, culture, destiny, and the time element are all material causes. Agitated by these material causes, the 11 factions transform into hundreds of factions, and then it's thousands, and then into millions. But all these transformations do not take place automatically by mutual combination. Rather, they are under the direction of the Supreme Personality of Godhead.
Okay. So the verse has 2 parts. The first part I'll explain, and the second part I'll see if you would like to explain. So the first part is essentially a continuation of the theme that Jat Bharat has been building, that the 11 functions of the mind, one mind, 11 functions, right? The first expansion. Then he says based on dravya, which is the objects, then swabhav, which is antakarna, one's intrinsic nature, then ashaya. Ashaya means culture, karma, destiny, and kal, time. So based on these things, the interaction multiplies several fold, right? So in these 5 things that is mentioned, 3, which is Kal, Desh, and Patra, time, culture, and material objects, they are influenced by the other 2, Swabhav and Karma. And by these influences, they become unlimited, right? So there is mind. On top of the mind, there is Kal, Desh, Patra. On top of Kal, Desh, Patra, there is Swabhav and Karma. And by repeated combinations, right? So Vishnu Chakravarti explains how it expands unlimitedly. So he begins by saying that there are unlimited objects like sandalwood, musk, gold, and silver, etc. Right? So now this talks with respect to the patra, unlimited objects. Then he says that people have unlimited swabhav. People have unlimited nature. Why are they unlimited? Because, and this Krishna says how the 3 modes, they repeatedly combined and recombine. Goodness, passion, ignorance, and then that recombines to form goodness, goodness, passion, ignorance. That recombines to form goodness, passion, passion, goodness, ignorance. So that just like the 3 colors, can be mixed again and again to create infinite number of colors. So these 3 modes recombine to give infinite number of swabhav. Right? So we have infinite objects, we have infinite swabhav. So when the swabhav is now interacting with the object, So there are unlimited propensities that are now interacting with unlimited objects. So infinity times infinity becomes again infinite. Right? Case in point is that there is a painting that's been made. It is a manifestation of one of the unlimited objects, and people will come and appreciate it in unlimited ways. Some might find it good, some might find it ugly, some may read different things. Right? So these recombinations become further expand. Now, this unlimited interactions between unlimited nature and unlimited objects, it is further impacted by time. So a child may interact, a child with a certain nature might interact with an object in a different way compared to an adult or an old person. The same person may interact to an object favorably at a certain point of time and unfavorably at a different point of time. Right? So the person may, in the morning, may interact differently because it's a different point of time compared to night. Right? So these unlimited interactions now become further unlimited by the impact of time. And the final variance comes by virtue of circumstances. That given these unlimited interactions that are happening, these 4 unlimited interactions that are happening, then circumstances, which is another way of talking about karma or destiny, will make these interactions again further unlimited. Right? So even if the first 4 are set, for instance, if there is a big plate of food put in front of a person, if he's hungry, he will interact differently with it. If he's sick, he will interact differently. If he's fully satiated, he'll interact differently. So even though the food may be the same, his nature may be the same, his propensity may be the same, but the circumstance will now control it. So Jat Bharat is making this point to show how the mind becomes unlimited in its power. One might say this is just a mind sitting in a person. But first he says the mind expands into 11 functions. And then these 11 functions, they interact with the 5 functions. And in these subsequent interactions, they continue to expand in an unlimited way. Okay, so this was the first part. The second part of the verse, which I'd like to hear from you, is when he says that these transformations take place under the direction of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So what do you understand by this? Why does Jat Bharat put this caveat? Because when you read it, the flow that he is taking King Rahugana is that you are responsible for your material conditioning by surrendering to the mind. And then he's talking about the powers of the mind. Now he does a 180 and say what is actually happening under the direction of the Supreme Lord. So why do you think he brings this into focus?
Krishna Prabhu, because without the sanction of the Lord, nothing can happen, even though we can have, even to have this body also, to have the senses, we need the sanction of the Lord, because at the end of the day, depending on our karma and most importantly, our desire, then according to our desire, the Lord sanction, to make it happen.
Thank you, Prabhu. Very good. Any other thoughts?
whatever mind, basically, first point, as Prabhu said, it is the under the direction of Supreme Personality of Godhead. Whatever we do, a soul does. At the same time, where it leads to a soul, based on his mind when he interacts with the objects which are under the direction of Supreme Personality of Godhead, whether it is leading to enjoyment of the object or the detachment of the object. Supreme Lord is giving both based on one's consciousness.
Absolutely correct. Thank you. So yes, Jat Bharat, he's walking a fine line. We see Krishna walking that fine line in the Gita, that at one point he's cautioning Maharaj Rahugana and us about how powerful material nature is. But if the statement ended over there, then the situation would become hopeless. That I'm in the ring with an opponent that is much more powerful, that is infinitely multiplied and created a net around me. What's the hope? Or a person might say that yes, the mind is the cause of my fall down, so I will try and redeem myself with the mind. But the purpose of all this from Jat Bharat's perspective is to bring the jiva to the point of surrender to Krishna. So after having explained the power of the mind, Jat Bharat says that with all its vast reach and power, nevertheless, it is always under the control of the Lord. So now, if somebody has to conquer the mind, then the solution is to befriend the Lord. So this was, I think it's an analogy given by Srila Prabhupada, but I can't be 100% sure. I heard it in a lecture where the person was saying that you're in a ring and your opponent is a lot more powerful than you. Every time you go to fight with the opponent, he basically just wipes the mat with you, beats you up and sends you back. So what do? Two things you can do. One way is that you become more powerful than the opponent. The second way is that you make friends with somebody who's more powerful than the opponent. So the Gyanis and the Yogis, they follow the first method. They try to become more powerful than the mind, which is doable, but a very difficult scenario. The devotees, they befriend somebody that is vastly more powerful than the mind. And the problem is solved. Right? So that's the reason why Jat Bharat, he has first talked about the power of the mind to indicate how complete material entrapment is. But now he's bringing the attention to the fact that with all its power, it is nothing in front of the power of the Lord. So as you know, in the Bhagavad Gita, both the Jiva and the Paramatma are described as Kshetragya. Right? This is in the 13th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. So in his description of the mind, in verse 7, Jat Bharat describes the conditioned jiva. Verses 11 and 13, they mention the Paramatma. And verse 12 will talk about the liberated jiva. So they are all talking about Kshetragya, but with the two acceptable meanings of Kshetragya. 7 talks about the jiva who's conditioned. 12 talks about the jiva who is liberated. And verses 11 and 13 talk about the Kshetragya or the Paramatma. So when the mind acts independently of the Lord, it does not change the factual situation. So just because a person in a country might say, I don't care about the king, it does not mean that the person has become more powerful than the king. Right? Even in the current situation, there are people that are known as anti-establishmentarians. There are people who are known as anarchists. And they basically say, I don't believe in laws of the country. I don't believe in the laws of the nation. But that position does not change the fact that if they break the law, they will be still held accountable for it. And similarly, when the jiva is under the material energy and believing itself to be independent of the Lord, does not change the fact that he is still under the control of the Lord, does not change the fact that it is only by the Lord's intervention that he can overcome material energy. So Prabhupada quotes a couple of verses from Bhagavad Gita 15:15, where Krishna says, Sarvasya Chaham Hridhi Sannivishto, that the Lord is in everyone's heart. He's the witness, he's the empowerer. And then Maya Dakshena Prakriti Suyate Socharacharam. And then the Lord is the controller of the material nature. So Prabhupada uses these two verses together to show that Krishna controls material nature. Krishna is constantly accompanying the jiva. So therefore, if the jiva has to overcome material nature, it just needs to turn to the Paramatma that is already sitting right next to him. So, so I created a small table that summarizes the characteristics of the mind. Essentially, it's just summation based on the verses. I sent the table over to Prem Kishore Prabhu, and he should send it over to you today. Moving on to verse. Let me see how we're doing with time. Okay, so this is also maybe a time to take a break, ask for any discussion topics, because the next set of verses are going to talk about the liberated jiva. So far, the discussion was the conditioned jiva. Okay, so we can pause here and see if there is any comments and discussion.
Hare Krishna Prabhu. Just I was thinking about this when they say the learning sensors and all that. Okay, it's a bit of a controversy, but I think everybody's talking about it, about the chat AI and all that. Now, it's a machine, but it's learning from human. Whatever garbage we have put everywhere, sometimes it's garbage, sometimes it's good thing, but this is what the database is, and now they already have like a robot that can converse with you. You ask a question with face expression and all that. But anyway, I know there's for us it does not really impact us in a way. We will never believe that they will become more intelligent than human being as they proclaim, maybe materially speaking, but not spiritually. But when you say without the sanction of the Lord, that means these AI machine will not be able to, even they say that they can feel or whatever.
Yeah, that is a big debate now. There are people who are cautioning that the AI is the biggest threat to the human society. It's an existential threat. And there are those who are saying that it will make things much easier and make things easier and simple. But essentially, it is just manipulating the forces of material nature. one can become, Prabhupada would say, right, that by manipulating it, you can become more expert in enjoying it, but you can't escape its consequences. So the consequences will still be there.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so if there are no further questions, we'll move on to the last set of verses in the chapter, verse 12. Kshetragya eta manaso vibhuti jivasya maya rachatasya nitya avehitaha papitirohitascha shuddho vichaste hayasuddha kartu.
The individual soul, bereft of Krishna consciousness, has many ideas and activities created in the mind by the external energy. They have been existing from time immemorial. Sometimes they are manifest in the awakening state and in the dream state. But during deep sleep, unconsciousness, or trance, they disappear. A person who is liberated in this life, Jivan Mukta, can see all these things vividly.
So verses 12 to 14 talk about the liberated soul. So as I mentioned, in the Bhagavad Gita, there are two Kshetragyas, the Jiva and the Paramatma. The previous verse, Paramatma was mentioned. And in the next verse, again, the Paramatma is mentioned. In this particular verse, the liberated Jiva is talked about. So verse 6 talked about the conditioned Jiva. This verse 12 talks about the liberated Jiva. And verses 11 and 13 talk about the Kshetragya, which is the Paramatma. So what are the characteristics that are different between the liberated and the conditioned Jiva? The conditioned Jiva has been understood to be influenced by the modes. The liberated Jiva knows the transformations of the mind, but does not try to identify with them or try to enjoy them. So it is therefore free from the samsara. Samsara is the cycle of reincarnation. So the liberated Jiva is free from samsara, and the conditioned Jiva is bound by the samsara. Right? So essentially what is happening, that when the conditioned Jiva is covered by the mind, then it performs impure actions against the recognition of the Lord. So the transformation of the mind have been present with the Jiva since time immemorial, Nitya. And Jagbharat says that they are manifest during waking and sleeping states, but do not manifest during deep sleep. So Vishwanath Chakravarti says that this deep sleep refers to the time of universal devastation. Now, deep sleep also refers to, it's one phase of the sleep also, right? There is, when a person is in deep sleep, the person does not dream anymore. But here, Vishwanath Chakravarti says that deep sleep refers to the time of universal devastation, when the souls are taken back into the body of Mahavishnu, and they're held in a state of Shushupti. So that is basically the consciousness is covered at that time. So they stay in there until the next time round of material creation happens, and then they're injected into the pradhan by the glands of Mahavishnu, and then they are awakened from this deep sleep, and they resume with their karma, with their swabhav, and this whole cycle begins again. So the liberated soul can see the transformations of the mind. What does it see? So it sees four things. It sees that these transformations of the mind are material. They are made of Maya. So what are the transformations of the mind? That was discussed earlier on, like the unlimited interaction between the senses and the object based on Kal, Desh, Patra. So it is able to see that all of these are essentially illusory. Second is, it recognizes that this has been happening since time immemorial. That its current existence is because of a chain of these transformations that were happening since the beginning of time. Third is that it understands that they sometimes manifest which is in the waking and the dreaming state, and sometimes disappear, which is during deep sleep and trance. So seeing this, the liberated soul absorbs himself in the Supreme Lord. And so once the liberated soul, the conditioned soul, it is absorbed in these things. The conditions, the liberated soul is able to walk away and sees that these are happening. And when it sees that all these are happening, it also sees that they're happening under the dominion of the Lord. And thus, such a person will now absorb himself in the Lord. And in the next two verses, Jad Bharat will describe the characteristics of the Supreme Lord. So Srila Prabhupada says that in 13.3, it is said that there are two kinds of Kshetragyas. One is the Jiva and one is the Paramatma. And there's a little bit of explanation on which we're familiar that who is the Jiva, who is the Paramatma. Then Prabhupada says that amongst the Jiva, so there are two kinds of Kshetragyas, the Jiva and the Paramatma. There are two kinds of Jiva. The Nitya Buddha, the Nitya Baddha, and the Nitya Mukta. Right? So the eternally liberated souls are living in the spiritual world. The eternally conditioned souls are living in the material world. The difference between the two is that a Nitya Mukta knows how he has become conditioned. And therefore, he tries to purify himself and return back to Godhead. Now, this Prabhupada says is a person who becomes a eventual Mukta. So Prabhupada says that when a Nitya Baddha is liberated, it is known as a Jivan Mukta. Okay, so this is a new term Prabhupada introduced. That so there is a Nitya Baddha, Nitya Mukta, and there is a Jivan Mukta. So what is a Jivan Mukta? A Jivan Mukta is a Nitya Baddha that has now become liberated. What is the characteristic of a Jivan Mukta? That a Jivan Mukta, he knows how he became conditioned. He purifies himself and returns back to Godhead. Right? So this is the path that is recommended for us who are aspiring transcendentalists. Okay, so let's go to the next two verses, 13 and 14. Kshetragyatma Purusha Purana Sakshat Swayam Jyotirajah Paresha Narayano Bhagavan Vasudeva Swamagayatmi Avadhyamanaham Yatha Nilaha Sthavar Janakadman Atmaswarupena Nivashtaishe Evam Paro Bhagavan Vasudeva Kshetragyatmedam Anupravishtaha.
There are two kinds of Kshetra Raj, the living entity, as explained above, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is explained as follows. He is all prevailing cause of creation. He is full in himself and is not dependent on others. He is perceived by hearing and direct perception. He is self-effulgent and does not experience birth, death, old age, and disease. He is the controller of all the demigods, beginning with Lord Brahma. He is called Narayana, and he is the shelter of living entities after the annihilation of this material world. He is full of opulences, and he is the resting place of everything material. He is therefore known as Vasudeva, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. By his own potency, he is present within the hearts of all living entities, just as air or vital force is within the bodies of all beings, moving and non-moving. In this way, he controls the body. In his partial features, the Supreme Personality of Godhead enters all bodies and controls them.
Okay, so as I mentioned, these two verses essentially talk about the characteristics of the Supreme Lord. It's interesting that it also gives an explanation of the two popular names for the Lord. So said that he is called Narayan as he is a shelter of the living entities after the annihilation of the material world. And so the word Narayan means, Ayan means lie down, and Nar means Jiva. So the word Narayan refers to that in which the Jivas take shelter of. Right? Narayan also means he who lies down. So another meaning of Narayan is when Lord Vishnu lies in the causal ocean or the Garbhoda ocean. That another meaning of Narayan there. The second reference given to Vasudeva. So Vasudeva is Vas means to reside. So it said he is a resting place of everything material. He is therefore known as Vasudeva. So everything material resides in the Lord. Vasudeva also means Paramatma, the he who resides in everything, he who takes vas in everything. So some of the characteristics that are described here, and again I summarize this in a table and put it in the document, that he pervades everywhere. Atma. He is the cause of the universe. Purana. He has a form of a human-like form that is self-revealing. Swayam Jyoti. He is devoid of material birth. Aja. He is the Lord of all others, such as Brahma. So Parishaha. And then he lies in the Karana ocean, Narayana. He is full of 6 powers. Bhagavan as the Lord of Vaikuntha. He is the son of Vasudeva. Another meaning of Vasudeva is also the one that we are more familiar with is Krishna, the son of Vasudeva. So Vishwanath Chakravarti says that he is also the son of Vasudeva, the master of Mathura and Dwarka. He is the object of the mind for the liberated Jiva, since he is his Suamayaya. Suamayaya means that he is completely free of Maya. And he is the object of the meditation for the liberated soul because of his Swarup Shakti or his mercy. So after having described the characteristics of the Lord, Chat Bharat also says that the Lord is easily attained by the liberated Jiva. So the example that is given is that the air in the form of Pran, so he says Atma Swarupena, enters all beings and controls them. Ishat. So the Lord enters this universe. Idam. So one does not have to leave the material world and travel to the spiritual world to attain the Lord. The Lord has traveled from the spiritual world into the material world. And in the material world, he has traveled to be right next to the Jiva. So the Lord is therefore easily attainable by the liberated jiva. So Srila Prabhupada expands on this point. He quotes Bhagavad Gita 15:15, Sarvasya chaham hridhi sanivishto mata smriti jnano upanam cha, that everything is being controlled. Sarvasya chaham hridhi sanivishto. The Lord is living in everyone's heart as Paramatma. He is the Purusha avatar who has created the material world. So the Purusha avatars are also known as Narayan, because they, whether it is Karnodaksha Vishnu, Garbhodaksha Vishnu, or Shivodaksha Vishnu, they are Narayan in the sense that they give shelter to the Nar, and they also lie into the in the ocean. Shivodaksha Vishnu in the Sheesh Sagar, Garbhodaksha Vishnu in Garbhodaksha ocean, and Karnodaksha Vishnu in Karna Sagar. And so they are collectively also known as Narayan. And then Prabhupada just gives us a little bit of background. That first expansion of the Godhead is Baldev. Next expansion is Vasudev, Sankarsana, and Rudra Pradyumna. Vasudev is the original cause of the Brahmajyoti, and the Brahmajyoti is the expansion of the rays of the body of Vasudev. Of course, Brahma Samhita, Yasya Prabha, Prabhuto Jagadanda Poti, that the glowing effulgence of his form is the impersonal Brahman. Right, so this is going to complicate matters a little bit. Prabhupada talks about yet another Vasudev that appears in the Chaturvyu. So there is the expansions of Krishna into Baldev, and then Baldev expands to Sankarsana, and Sankarsana expands to Vasudev, Sankarsana, and Rudra and Pradyumna. And the bodily effulgence of Vasudev in the Chaturvyu is the Brahmajyoti. So the characteristics of the Lord that are given is Atma, he is the all-pervading cause of creation, Purusha, the unrestricted controller, Purana, the original, Sakshat, he is perceived by hearing and direct perception. Swayam Jyoti is self-emergent, Aja, that never experiences birth, that is his old age, Paresha, controller of demigods, Narayan, that is the shelter of the jivas after the annihilation of the world, Bhagwan, full of appearances, Vasudev is the resting place of everything material, and Swamayatmani Avidyamana, that is present within the heart of all living entities, Paramatma form. And the verse 14 says, how just as the air enters and controls all moving and stationary beings in the form of Pran, Lord Vasudev, the knower of all bodies, enters into the bodies and controls them. Okay, so let's move on to verse 15. Nayavadetam tanu brinnarendra viduyamayam vayanodayena vimukta sango jita sat sapatno veda matatvam brahma titatava.
My dear King Rahogana, as long as a conditioned soul accepts the material body and is not freed from the contamination of material enjoyment, and as long as he does not conquer his six enemies and come to the platform of self-realization by awakening his spiritual knowledge, he has to wander among different places and different species of life in this material world.
So Jan Bharat has systematically taken the king through the, so he started talking about the nature of the mind, that how the mind can condition and be the cause of liberation. Based on that, he talked about the condition and the liberated jiva, and then he talked about the role of the Lord. So he has now kind of built this, is painted this scenario, right? There is the Lord, there is the conditioned jiva, there is the liberated jiva, there's the role of the mind in both of them. Now he comes to the real purpose why he's talking about all this, which is the deliverance of the conditioned soul. Right? He's not talking about this just to just to defeat the king in an argument. He wants to give him the message. And that's the nature of an expert preacher, that when somebody asks him the question, he answers the question, but he also takes the person one step beyond. That where does he actually need to be? So answering the question is simply a hook to attract the mind of the inquirer. And when the mind is attracted to the speaker, then the speaker reveals the real knowledge. So in these last 3 verses of the chapter, Jat Bharat, he is now talking about how can a conditioned jiva become liberated. So he says then 3 things happen. The jiva becomes liberated, becomes free from material contaminations, conquers the 6 enemies, and becomes self-realized through spiritual knowledge. So Prabhupada says that when one's mind is absorbed in material conception, he thinks that he belongs to a particular nation, family, etc. They are known as upadhis. Right? So the first is becoming free of material contamination, which is sarvupadhi vinir mukta. Then Prabhupada says, as long as one is not freed, he has to continue the material existence. The human form of life is meant for cleansing that. And if it is not done, then one has to repeat the cycle of birth and death. And so, and this is going to be expanded in the subsequent verses. So we'll do verse 16. Nayavadetan manatmalingam samsar tapavapanam janasya yachokamohamaya ragalopa Vairānubandham mamatam vidate.
The sole designation, the mind, is a cause of all tribulation in the material world. As long as this fact is unknown to the conditioned living entity, he has to accept the miserable condition of the material body and wander within this universe in different positions. Because the mind is affected by disease, lamentation, illusion, attachment, greed, and enmity, it creates bondage and a false sense of intimacy within this material world.
So the previous verse talked about how one can be liberated. This verse is a summation of how one becomes conditioned. That the mind is, like he says, is like if you have a field and you sow seeds in it, then so many plants come out which have their own seeds and they multiply. So the mind is the sowing ground of all the tribulations in the material world. And it is covering the soul, Atmalingam. Right? So it's covering the source, and it is the cause of lamentation and illusion and disease, attachment, greed, and enmity. And all this is happening because it has possessiveness over the sense objects and that attraction to the material world. So this is essentially simply a summation of the condition, the cause of the conditioning of the jiva. And Prabhupada says that, once again repeating the point, mind is the cause of both bondage and liberation. The impure mind is the cause of bondage, and the pure mind is the cause of the liberation. Okay, so we now come to the last verse of the chapter. Bhratravyamenam tadadvaraviryam upekashyadyetam apramataha gurur haresha charanopashanastro jahi galikam swayamatmamosham.
This uncontrolled mind is the greatest enemy of all living entity. If one neglect it or give it a chance, it will grow more and more powerful and will become victorious. Although it is not factual, it is very strong. It covers the constitutional position of the soul. O king, please try to conquer his mind by the weapon of service to the lotus feet of the spiritual master and of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Do this with great care.
Okay, so the last verse gives the solution, right? So the mind is powerful. The uncontrolled mind is the cause of the downfall. The liberated mind is the cause of liberation. So how do you conquer the mind? So Jat Bharat gives three methods in this verse that can be practiced together. So first he says is upeksha, by neglect. That one neglects the pushing of the mind, then the mind goes away. Srila Prabhupada gives sometimes this example that if you have two dogs, when the dog that is neglected becomes weak and is defeated by the dog that is fed. So when one neglects the material pushings of the mind and pays attention to the spiritual nature of it, then the material mind automatically becomes weak. So from a practical perspective, upeksha means that don't pay much mind to the mind. That let it tolerate its sufferings, tolerate its pushings, but don't pay much attention to it. The second is the flip side of it, is upramata. Upramata means attentiveness. So neglect the material mind and be attentive to the spiritual mind. And the third is that the weapon of the service to the lotus feet of Guru and the Lord. Guru Raresha Charuno Pashana Astru. So how can one do this? How can one become neglectful to the material mind and attentive to the spiritual mind? By serving the lotus feet of the Guru and the Lord. So for a person who is possessed, it's difficult to drive out the ghost by itself, but the person can take help from somebody else. So when a person is under the control of the mind, it is difficult to change the nature of the control. But if one gets help from Guru and Krishna, then upeksha and apramata can happen. And so Prabhupada summarizes this, that there is one easy weapon with which the mind can be conquered: neglect. The mind is trying to do this and that. We should become very expert in disobeying the mind's order. Gradually, the mind should be trained to obey the orders of the soul. Right? So this is combining upeksha with apramata. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur says that to control the mind, one should beat it with the shoe many times just after awakening, and well, here Prabhupada does not say, but it says that in the morning you should beat it with the shoe, and in the evening you should beat it with the broom. Right. So it's another way of saying that control, being in control of the mind rather than letting the mind control you. If one does not do so, one is doomed to follow the dictates of the mind. Another bona fide process is to abide strictly by the orders of the spiritual master and engage in the Lord's service. And Prabhupada gives the famous verse by Rupa Goswami: Brahmanda Brahmite Kono Bhagavan Jiva Guru Krishna Prasad Upaye Bhakti Lata Jiva. One receives the seed of devotional service by the mercy of Guru and Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. One's real life begins. If one abides by the orders of the spiritual master, by the grace of Krishna, he is freed from the service of the mind. So this is the end of the 11th chapter. I'll quickly do a recap, and then after that pause for any discussion. So the chapter has 17 verses. Began with Jat Bharat chastising the king and materialists, saying the materialists cannot understand tattva. Then the bulk of the chapter is how the mind is the cause of the entanglement, what is the function of the mind. Then Jat Bharat talks about the liberated soul and the conditioned soul, the difference between the two, how they interact, the difference of the interaction between the two with the material nature. He also spoke about the potency of the mind, how it expands almost unlimitedly, and how a conditioned soul is under the potency of the mind, whereas a liberated soul is beyond the potency. And then finally, he talks about the deliverance of the conditioned soul, which finally comes to taking shelter of Guru and Krishna. Okay, so let me pause here and see if there is any questions, comments.
Hare Krishna Prabhu. Not a question, just a comment. We saw like everywhere, many places, it talk about the mind. The mind is the greatest enemy, and Arjuna even say he cannot control the mind, he can control the wind. And still, like we as devotee, practicing devotee, we try to chant, to concentrate the mind to hear, but it's still, anyway, for me, it's still like as soon as you let go, it goes. You have to be constantly, and I don't know if one day there will be any hope, for example, we really be able to control the mind. And here, I think the last verse, it say that to take the shelter of Guru and Krishna. I think this is a control, because the mind itself is like crazy to really get hold of it. I think if we try to serve Guru and Krishna, this is the control of the mind. I don't know if I'm right by saying that, but it's very difficult to even to chant, like one round correctly is like, it's difficult.
And you're absolutely right. You summarized the chapter very well, that on our own, we can't control the mind. So like they say, right, when you chant, you keep bringing your mind back to the holy name, right? That's what they say. So what does that mean? That you expect the mind to keep going away from the holy name. So the injunction is not that when you chant, then you keep your mind on the holy name. The injunction is you keep getting your mind back to the holy name. So the person who's giving these injunctions, they're also aware that in a conditioned state, we can't keep our mind on the holy name. All we can do is try to get it back to the holy name. It'll go back again, and then it'll come back. It'll keep coming back. The sincerity in trying that is what attracts the mercy of Guru and Krishna. The famous example Prabhupada gives of the ocean swallowing the eggs of a sparrow. And then the sparrow said, I'll dry up the ocean. And with a small beak, it started taking the water away, and the ocean started laughing. And then Garud comes and says, I'll dry you up. Like the sparrow couldn't draw it, but Garud was attracted by the sincerity of the sparrow. And then Prabhupada says, the sparrow couldn't dry the ocean, but Garud can dry up the ocean. So then the ocean quickly gave back the eggs. But if the sparrow wasn't even trying to do that, taking the beaks and taking small drops of water, knowing very well that the ocean is infinitely larger than its beak, it didn't do that, it wouldn't have attracted the mercy of Garud. So that's why we need to do the little thing we do, that try and get our mind back. Not that on our own we'll be able to succeed, but it attracts the mercy of Guru and Krishna. And then they are infinitely powerful than the mind. So for them, it's like, okay, now just stay, set aside, stand. So that's why Prabhupada, especially in the last part of the chapter, he focuses on how the material nature is subservient to Krishna, how Krishna is all powerful, to emphasize on this aspect. So thank you for summarizing it very nicely, Prabhu.
Yeah, I want to add this how to part of this. All three: free from material contamination, conquering the six senses, or self-realized through the knowledge, right? So if you observe Guru Maharaj, any of this how to refers to the Vaishnava Sangha, right? So even to the very first one, free from material contamination, it is in our contaminated state. If you want to do it individually, it's very hard to do it. We need the mercy of Vaishnava, or definitely it's mercy of Guru, but mercy of devotees.
Absolutely. And you see that most of these, where there is the Sangha of practicing devotees, where the focus is not just in the study of philosophy, but in the application of philosophy, then there is a lot of there's a lot of meditation on this aspect, that the cause of the suffering, the cause of the holdback is identified, the fallibility of one's individual to overcome is identified, and what are the most potent ways to do, which, as you rightly pointed out, is Vaishnava Sangha, then taking shelter of the Guru and Krishna, because that's the practical way for practicing devotees. We are not in the program of sitting and meditating and controlling our mind. We are in the program of knowing that we have to control the mind, but also knowing that three things: that we have to try and control the mind, but at the same time we have to take shelter of Guru and Krishna, and these three things together will give us our desired results.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna. Thank you so much for elaborating so nicely on the mind of the cause of material entanglement and deliverance of the conditioned soul. I thought it's like a postgraduate study of chapter 6, where it's where the actions of the mind is touched on in some detail, but the way you explained it this evening, I thought was really wonderful. Is more of a comment I'm trying to make. I really like the example you give about a fight in a ring, and how the Gyanis and the Yogis they try to become more powerful than the mind. In other words, they're depending on their own strength. But for the bhaktas, for the devotees, he makes friend with someone who is more powerful than the mind, and that's the Supreme Lord. I thought really sticks out, and I really like, in this short chapter, it's just 17 verses, but 15, 16, and 17, it just summarizes very nicely how the mind could be delivered, the conditioned soul could be delivered from illusion. Just like in verse number 15, it describes that the question is asked, how long can the jiva wander in samsara? And then the answer is until he becomes free from material contamination, one. Number two, he conquers the 6 enemies. And number 3, becomes self-realized through spiritual knowledge. But so verse 16 explains that the mind is the sowing ground of all tribulation. But then the last verse actually is very interesting. It describes, it's like explaining the most important thing, and that is how to conquer the mind. Then the uncontrolled mind is the greatest enemy of the living entity, and given a chance, it will become powerful and cover the constitutional position of the jiva. And I like the 3 points that are being discussed in the 17th verse. That is upekshaya, that's neglect and always, even though you neglect the mind, just always be attentive, because the mind is going to just make some kind of a move to get you trapped, entangled. So neglect is one thing, but we have to be very attentive. And then the final point is the weapon of service to the lotus feet of Guru and Krishna. That's the best way to control the mind. It's like positive engagement. The easy weapon to control the mind is neglect. One should disobey the orders of the mind expertly, abide by the orders of Guru, and engage in the service of the Lord. I thought this evening, for the first time, I really grasped, very deep insight. It really stuck in me. Even though we have dealt with it, so much in different chapters, but I thought this evening's discussion was really exceptional, at least for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prabhu, and thank you so much for also very nicely summarizing the chapter with your realizations. Hearing you also was these things. The more you hear, the deeper they go in your heart. So I completely agree with you. I also had the same experience, that we hear this term, mind is a friend and enemy, so many times that it just becomes just a term, just a phrase. But Jad Bharat, he explains it so systematically and with so much more details. It goes deeper. And the next chapter, of course, is it's an even shorter chapter. It has 16 verses, but he builds upon this to talk about knowing that the mind is this. How do you deal with the material world? So we'll discuss this. I won't be able to meet this Wednesday, but next week, Monday and Wednesday, we'll meet. And after that, I'm actually traveling to India, so we'll be on a month's break. But in that Monday, Wednesday, at least my hope is that I will complete the 12th chapter. The 13th and 14th chapters are actually companion chapters. They kind of go together. They're very similar to Narad Muni giving this whole elaborate allegory about what was to Prachinavari, right? What was the name of the king that was given in the allegory?
Was it the chariot and
No, what was the name?
Puranjana, Prabhu.
Puranjana. Thank you. Getting old, things. Sometimes the name just goes out of my mind. So very similar to that allegory. So the 13th chapter is the allegory, and the 14th chapter is the explanation of the allegory. So depends on how it goes. The 12th chapter is probably either one class or 1.5 class. So we'll see how that goes. But I'll see you. I'll meet you again next Monday. We'll start with the 12th chapter. So thank you so much.
And one other thing, Paramatma Prabhu, you had question on the presentation.
Well, I was just asking you because you had scheduled that.
Yeah. Basically, we are waiting to conclude with this. So 2 things. As we have opened up slot on Wednesday, if you are ready, you're open to have that. Otherwise, we can wait for Prabhu to go like next week, and we can schedule on a sequential way. Mainly focus will be on the Swadhyay and whoever wants to pick up the presentation.
whatever you advise me, yeah, it's what the devotees and the group decides. I don't have a problem. And I was thinking it's unit 15. Unit 15 means from chapter 13 of the fourth canto going through to chapter 23 inclusive. That's the 11 chapters in 1.5 hours. It's just like,
No, that's not the intention.
it's just an
Yeah,
overview.
yeah. That's not the intention. You can, for the presentation, you can pick one or the two chapters. But Swadhyaya, if you want to do, we can go over that in a separate thing.
In other words, you're saying that I can do either one of them.
Either one of them, yeah. Either Swadhyaya fully, and we can pick up 1 to 2 chapters. We should not be overwhelming, like running through all the 11 chapters in one session. Yeah.
Okay, so you'll have to advise me whether well, it's Monday already, Tuesday tomorrow, then the next day is Wednesday.
So,
you advise me what
so
you want
we can wait for the conclusion from starting the following Monday. We can have it. I'll publish that schedule.
In other words, we don't have anything this Wednesday.
This Wednesday.
We don't have anything this Wednesday.
We don't have anything.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
So whatever you advise me, I'll follow that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so
Hare
much.
Krishna.
Yeah, thank you. Panchakalpatarubhyascha kripasindhubhya vajnapatitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Anant Koti Vaishnava ki jai.
Jai.
Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Jai Gaur Premanand. Hare Krishna. Thank you so much.